diagnose it quickly, if you can't treat it quickly, the more people you actually diagnose, you're going to have a problem, aren't you, with beds, doctors, enough people to treat it and enough places to treat it in.
Potentially, I think what we normally see is that, so if you're taking a condition like macular degeneration, pretty much everybody who you're going to see for macular degeneration, you're going to see at some point. Let's suppose the diagnosis doesn't happen at an early appointment. Chances are we are going to pick it up later in the disease condition, and that still means we're going to be seeing that patient, and potentially it means that we're going to need to treat them for a much longer period of time with many more interventions. With a lot of our diseases, if we can pick it up very early, sometimes we can get control of it very early as well. So there is a risk whenever you get into this, a much better ability to detect disease, you'll end up with more patients. But my feeling is our clinics are going to have fewer patients who don't need to be there, because those ones who don't need to come in don't need to be reviewed. And those patients who do need to be there, I think we would see them anyway, but hopefully we'll see them much earlier and get on with the treatment really early. The interesting thing, and what some of my colleagues are coming up with at the moment, is this field called oculomics, which is the idea that the eye can be a window to many other conditions affecting the body, and we're beginning to find evidence that you can detect other diseases in OCT. So a colleague of mine, Siegfried Wagner, and the team recently published a paper showing that you can possibly detect Parkinson's disease 7 years before it's clinically apparent using a scan of the eye, and you can only do that with AI. A human can't do that. So for those ones, maybe the impact's going to be a little less clear. You may start picking up many normal conditions very early, and some of those can have a big impact on the first.
Could AI have other effects? And we're talking about detection here, but what about actual treatment? Has AI got a relevance there?
I think it can hopefully help us to target treatment better. So for many conditions, we have many different options of what we might treat that patient with. And hopefully through AI, one of the things you can imagine is it helps us to tailor the treatment to the individual patient much better. So I think it could help us to, select treatments in that way. In terms of providing a physical intervention like surgery, there's lots of advances at the moment around robotic surgery, for example. Now, if you play that forwards a very long time, you could imagine a robot autonomously operating on an eye. And there's no question that robot's going to be using AI to do it. They're going to be using AI to understand what they're looking at, AI to control their limbs and control their instruments. But that's probably on a slightly longer time scale.
Pete Thomas. And if you dare to look even further ahead, then Pete Thomas is just one of the contributors to a programme this coming Sunday evening, in which I've been looking backwards and forwards 50 years to mark a half century of my preventing in touch and the changes which have happened and might happen in the lives of blind and partially sighted people. We'll be combining a serious look at how things like technology, medical and public attitudes have altered our lives, along with some of the many lighter moments that have occurred on In Touch. That's 55th edition tonight on Radio 4 at 7:15 and also available on BBC Sounds. That's it for us, for me, Peter White, and producer Beth Hemmings. Goodbye.
And the phone number. In Touch, it's 0161 836 1338. The email address is intouch@bbc.co.uk.
New drama on BBC Radio 4.
Seven are some of the most dangerous rip currents in the world. Many souls have been lost to these waters.
Starring Jason Hughes.
You were right there in my neck, like a gift from God. You have to go to the police. He's right there. You want to see me angry?
The past can pull you under.
I think she's still alive.
I got tired of the missing posters day after day, just endlessly reliving that my mum had disappeared.
7. Listen on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds this Thursday afternoon at 2:15. BBC News at 6 o'clock on Sunday the 28th of July. This is Jane Steele. Good morning. Israel has hit Hezbollah targets in Lebanon after a rocket attack killed 12 children in occupied Golan Heights. 18 others were injured. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is due to meet his security cabinet later to discuss any further response. From Jerusalem, Barbara Usher reports.
The rocket attack has greatly increased fears that the cross-border conflict between Israel and Hezbollah could trigger an all-out war. It devastated the village of Majd al-Shams, which is home to an Arab Druze minority. The leader of the Druze community put out an angry and anguished statement condemning what he called a brutal, murderous terrorist attack targeting innocent children. Israel blamed Hezbollah for the strike, which the Lebanese movement had categorically denied, but it had claimed responsibility for 4 attacks earlier in the afternoon before the scale of the Majd al-Shams tragedy became clear. The Israeli Prime Minister has said Hezbollah will pay a heavy price. Will be meeting his security cabinet today to discuss how to respond.
The former Home Secretary Colin Patel has become the 5th candidate into the Conservative leadership race, pledging to unite the party and visit match fit for Sunday Telegraph. She also warns patrols against are so popular with finger pointing and self-indulgence and wrong last general election. Political correspondent Helen Cat. The need to unite is becoming a common refrain for would-be leaders of the Conservative Party. Dame Britty says unity should be put before personal vendettas. This is the first time that she's run for the leadership of the party. She's been a prominent figure on the right for many years, but she says that Tory's future doesn't lie in obsessing over what is left over. At the heart of her pitch is a direct appeal to party members. She describes them as heroic and promises to give them more power over policy. Tory members will get the final say on who wins after MPs have whittled down the list of candidates to 2. So far, 5 people have put themselves forward: Priti Patel, Mel Stride, James Cleverly, Tom Tugendhat and Nick Jenrick. Footage has emerged of violence reportedly before a police officer kicked and stabbed a man at Manchester Airport. A new video shows clashes in which 3 officers end up on the floor. The Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, has reiterated his call for the authorities to be given space to complete their investigations. The details from Phil McCann.
Millions have now seen a viral video showing a police officer stamping on and kicking the head of a man on the ground at Manchester Airport. Now, CCTV footage obtained by the Manchester Evening News, but not verified by the BBC, shows what happened just beforehand. 3 officers can be seen appearing to try to apprehend the man before another man next to him approaches the police and punches a throat. The man being apprehended breaks free and punches a throne between him and 2 female officers who hit the ground. He then drags the 3rd male officer to the ground before one of the others tases him. It's at that point that the male officer kicks him and stabs on his head. All officers were taken to hospital, one with a broken nose, while 4 people were arrested and released on bail. 1 officer is now facing a criminal investigation and has been suspended from duties.
Voting is due to begin in Venezuela in about 3 hours in a presidential election. Polls suggest the incumbent, Nicolas Maduro, is trailing his rival, Juan González Urrutia. Mr. Maduro has warned of a bloodbath if he loses. Analysts say he's unlikely to concede defeat. 13 gold medals are due to be awarded on the second official day of competition at the Paris Olympics. There are 3 swimming finals. It's an historic 3rd triumph for a member of Team GB. Our sports correspondent Joe Linsky explains.
For Adam Peaty, the last 4 years have been his most difficult Olympic cycle. He spent time away from swimming to prioritise his mental health, and yet tonight he could join an elite club in his sport. He goes for gold in the 100-metre breaststroke and could win the race for the 3rd Games in a row. Yesterday was Team GB's best opening day of an Olympics since 1980, with medals in road cycling and diving. And later today, another British star, Andy Murray, takes to a tennis court for what could be the final time before retirement. He partners Dan Evans in the men's doubles against a Japanese pair of Kei Nishikori and Taro Daniel.
Organisers of the Olympics have cancelled a triathlon training session in the Seine because of pollution. France has had heavy rain over the past 2 days. The decision was reached following tests of the water quality. Officials remain confident that triathlon events will still be able to go ahead as planned on Tuesday and Wednesday. BBC News.
Many thanks, James Steele. This is BBC Radio 4. Beyond Belief is coming up next. Then we head to East Lothian to meet professional sheep shearer Una Cameron as she prepares for a world record shearing attempt. And later at 7:10, a program that looks at the ethical and religious issues of the week, Sunday, takes a closer look into Kamala Harris's religious background.
The direct translation of orangutan is people from the forest.
Looking to the natural world, to question what it means to be human.
In reality, we forget almost everything, and we misremember most of the rest.
What fish can teach us about memory, and lessons from fungi about working together.
Mycorrhizal fungi and their networks are already acting as this colossal carbon store.
She's Becky Ripley.
And she's Emily Knight. We are essentially the ape that never grew up.
Join us for the new series of Nature Bag on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
This Monday to Friday at 1:45.
Now on BBC Radio 4, we've reached for divine heights in poetry with Beyond Belief, recorded at this year's Bradford Literature Festival.
So my oldest daughter, about 10 years ago, she came back and she said she'd got a tattoo. And I was absolutely furious about her getting a tattoo until I saw what it was. And she had on her arm, written on her arm, a line from The Tempest, which is something that Prospero says to Miranda, Dad says to his daughter. The line is, "What seest thou else?" I love that line in The Tempest because it's not just about what you see, it's what else do you see. And I think one of the things that we're about today, we're talking about reaching for divine heights. And poetry is one of those ways. It's not just about what you see, it's what else do you see. And so this is a What Seest Thou Else type of programme, and we have three brilliant poets to help us understand something of the way in which poetry can help us to reach divine heights. I'm Giles Fraser, I'm a vicar, I'm a broadcaster, and I'm at the Bradford Literature Festival today with these three poets who are constantly seeking ways to make what Thomas Merton called raids on the unspeakable. Camille Ralphs is a poet, critic, and editor of the Times Literary Supplement. Her collection, After You Were, I Am, saw her hailed as a modern metaphysical poet, released earlier this year. You're wincing. Does that embarrass you?
I suspect we'll be coming back to that.
Wonderful. Testament is a rapper, poet, playwright, lives just down the road here in West Yorkshire, local lad. Lovely to have you here, my friend.
Hey, nice to be here.
And finally, Kate Fox, much loved performer. Yes, much loved performer. Here at the Bradford Literary Festival, your hometown, known for your comic poetry, but you've been exploring more existential themes of late?
Yes.
Wonderful. Very good. So let's just start. What is it about poetry that can help us reach divine heights, to make raids on the unspeakable? Camille.
Well, I think poetry is actually quite frequently failing to do that, which is what I really enjoy about it. There's a brilliant long essay by Ben Lerner called The Hatred of Poetry, which talks in depth about the ways in which various poems fail. In particular, he goes in on McGonagall's Taybridge disaster poem and how dreadful the metre is and how useless it is as a rendering of the disaster. But he points out that by doing this, by assuming that there are problems with the poem, he creates the circumstances for a great poem that could exist. It is still gesturing to something beyond itself, even when it is inarticulate. It is still making a raid on the inarticulate.
So try again, fail better in that sound of Beckett.
Yes, I suppose so. In terms of religious poetry, you might think about Paradise Lost and Milton's intention to justify the ways of God to man. And does he do that? No, not really. Was it Blake who said that he was at the devil's party without knowing it? That's kind of the opposite.
That whole idea of failure is, of course, I think you're right, intrinsic to the poetic enterprise when it comes to religion, because God is inexpressible, is beyond words.
Yes, going back to metaphysical poets, Marvell's poem, Dialogue Between the Body and the Soul, he says something like, being blinded by an eye, deafened by the drumming of an ear, saying that we are so trapped in our senses and bare expression of the world that we will never be able to comprehend something beyond that.
There's this idea of ascent, which is quite interesting, isn't it? The idea, you've got this, the story of Moses going up the mountain. As the higher he gets up the mountain, the less he's able to see. The closer you get to God, the more inexpressible things become. And that becomes a sort of a way of talking about poetic hubris almost, the idea that you're trying to do this thing that inevitably fails. Testament, do you think that's
sometimes? I mean, it's really complicated, and life is messy. I think God, our conception of God is really messy, and it's full of contradictions. At the same time, the kingdom of God is here. To see the world in a grain of sand, or to hold infinity in the palm of your hand, to quote Blake. So at the same time, we've got, is divinity far away from us, or is it all within us? Like a poet like Kay Tempest is saying, we are gods with a small g, which also in the Psalms, the writer of the Psalms uses a small g when talking about themselves.
Okay, you've drawn quite a lot from the Buddhist tradition, haven't you? Is that ascent language the sort of wrong sort of language for you?
Yes, although some Buddhist poetry does use it, but Zen doesn't, and is very, I think of it as being very horizontal.
What does that mean, horizontal?
Well, non-hierarchical, let's say. Not automatically that things that are up are the best things, and things that are down are the worst things.
Right.
And sometimes things that are side by side, they're brilliant things.
Okay, I think we've gone on long enough before we need a poem. So Camille, would you read? So would you tell us what you're going to read for us?
I'm going to read a poem from the first third of my book, which came out about 3 months ago. The first third comprises a series of rewritings of canonical or poetic prayers, sort of updated for the quote-unquote modern moment. This is after the 13th century mystic Mechthild of Magdeburg. O gush of bushfire, O quintuplet dead in the sea, sun pressing like a button on us all. O moon mirabilis, unmirrorable miracle, O you most bottomless of pools. O watch as high as Maslow's hierarchy, O eye body eyes, round sounds of quality honest. O timeless big time, day that lasts forever and a day. O you beforehand, all foreigners, red and wrong and firm. You beforehead of all foreheads, crowned or bound or night-capped, the most little and forgettable of all the its you made, makes these great claims of you.
One of the things I'm struck by with what you've just read, and this is going to sound really stupid to say, is like how many words. Okay, this is a very condensed set of words, and your collection of poetry is after you were I am. So you have that I am reference, which is obviously a reference originally to Exodus and the burning bush, and God is asked what his name is by Moses, and God says I am what I am, which is both, says something and it's also incredibly unhelpful at the same time. And the idea that you try and throw lots of words at this I am thing to try and give it some shape. Is that part of what's going on with what you're doing?
Yes, definitely. It's a sort of drawing out. The title of the book is a twisting of the ideas of the Bible passages mentioned. So the original quotation that after you were ends when Jesus is talking about Abraham, and say, Abraham's a big point and so on. They say, well, you know about Abraham, we're like 15 now. And then he says, verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was I am. And I was very drawn to that, messing about with the temporal language. But also, I wanted to say that in the same way that, Jesus is saying he's divine, I'm saying with after you were, I am, that I'm totally human, that I come after all the other humans, but I exist in this human context, and how can I not? And I am a very flawed person, and my interpretations of these canonical poems and prayers are necessarily going to be filled with flaws, and a very, very modern version of them.
Testament, the interesting thing about the words is if you look at the Bible, God is sort of a rock and a river and a fire and all these different things. Can't be all of those things at the same time. So you say all of this stuff and it collapses back. How successful can it be with this sort of great gush of words that beautiful words that we've heard from Camille.
The Bible seems to paint a picture of the personhood of God. Like God has a personality. God is happy. God is sad. God's upset with you. God's jealous. God's laughing. All these things appear in the poetry of the Bible. But if we are to try and grasp this sort of invisible person, if God exists or the spiritual exists, if there is something more than these electrical impulses and flesh and body, we are going to have to use to spend.
And it says, must attune beyond us, yet ourselves. And that tension between attune beyond us, the metaphysical, the divine heights, but yet ourselves, but yet also rooted and down to earth.
Absolutely, and there's a Zen Buddhist image of a finger pointing at the moon, and how, well, it's actually both the moon and the finger. You can't get rid of the finger, you've also got the moon. And it's that both thing that makes me think of, because poets are always quoting Keats on negative capability. This idea, he said, negative capability is the ability to accept uncertainties, mysteries and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And so much poetry is in that area, but with more or less tension, I suppose, about both.
Could you give us one of your poems? I want to hear. Tell us what you're going to read us, and perhaps this might be more down to earth.
Kind of, maybe. It's got fart in it, so maybe. It's called Finding the Object of Negation. It's based on an actual exercise that a Buddhist monk got a group of us to do. Essentially, before you can say there is no self, you have to check really carefully that there isn't any self. The sun, insistent behind the monk's ear, red traceries of vein visible. Another place, the self is not to be found. He has just asked us to look for it. It is not in the muffled trombone trills elicited by last night's lentil dal, which contained also clouds, garlic, patience, turmeric, a comet, and the Buddhas of the 10 directions. It is not in the left buttock, which in any case went numb during the liberating prayer, or in the shocked expression when the warden said the lines were in fact yellow. It goes without saying that it is not in the thumb and forefinger holding the pen, the motor impulse to move the hand, the synapses firing as it does, or the retinas scanning emergent syllables. Not in the neurological region calling up some line about stars, a wood-panelled room, a bear pacing a closet, a reflecting moon at the end of a pointing finger, a sky darkening to purple, which widens beyond its edges to a panorama, while in the background a very, very faint whistle.
So, what you have with this claiming of the ordinary language, you're using that for other purposes as well.
Yeah, and I think I'm also wanting, because I love reaching for the sublime and strongly suggesting there is something beyond and above. I actually love doing that, but I can only bear to do that if I've set up really well that that's also not a thing.
So are you quite suspicious of the way in which poetry can be unmoored from the reality of our lives?
Yes, and probably particularly religious poetry, or actually any words, any language which is trying to convince us of something, and by seduction. And I think, you know, a lot of biblical language is very seductive, and the Book of Common Prayer is supercharged. And Kate Tempest's poetry actually is kind of going, look, and just something in me resists that and goes, no, I see what you're trying to do, I'm not going there. And my biggest high at the moment, it's quite a big dopamine high, I have to say, quick and intense. Quick, honestly. And I realised it was surprising when I said that to someone. They were like, really? Because silence, 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 then someone throws in an amazing image Or they might read a poem actually, or they'll just say something. More silence, more silence, more silence. Another amazing image which connects. And it doesn't feel like anyone's trying to convince you, seduce you. You just, whoa, something happens though that's very inner and outer.
Testament, all this sort of self-critical spirit that we've been talking about now, that can be very debilitating. I mean, in a sense, you just want to get up and stand up and speak.
Yeah, I mean, the world's pretty messed up, and words are a great way to mess them up, mess up the world further, or to try and spread a little light and a little encouragement. So it's a real pragmatic thing. Obviously, poetry's everywhere in the adverts and in the pop songs and the far right, whatever. So it's going to get used. So I feel like my impulse to pick up the pen as a self-righteous child and you know it all teenager was like, let's save the world. Yeah, be the British most deaf. It didn't work out. But then there is the need for the self-critical because we are not enough. Certainly not on our own. And for me personally, I need something bigger than myself to get me through my 9 to 5. I'm a rapper, so from 10 to 3. So,
Camille, you're fascinated by the mystical, that whole sort of mystical side, and I'm trying to work out how the mystical sits together with testaments. We want to make the world a better place, we want to comfort us in our darkness, we want to just change the world.
Well, I would say that sometimes people can find solace in the fact of that great unknowable and the unbelievable suffering that a figure like Jesus went through. For example, in Anna Akhmatova's poem Requiem, at the beginning of that, she writes about how she would go to the prison where her son was being held for 17 years during the Stalinist purges. A woman recognized her as the poet Anna Akhmatova and said to her, "Can you describe this?" And Anna Akhmatova thought about it and said, "Yes." And then she went and wrote Requiem, part of which details the crucifixion and the suffering of Mary watching her son on the cross. So I think there are ways in which the transcendent can show us something about the inner world, and as much as the opposite is true.
Testament, you're a Blake aficionado, aren't you? That's your...
I would definitely say fan. But I have no rosettes or degrees in Blake.
So will you give us a poem? This is, I think, inspired by the great William Blake.
Yeah, this is inspired by the Organs of Innocence, in which the first 4 lines are really iconic, and he kind of rants about the state of the world. Hip hop is my poetry, rap is my poetry, so brace yourself. To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your